The last Maimed had 3 themes. This Maimed has 2 themes. The flanks, the beginning and the end of the Maimed, are about Machzas HaShekel. The middle of the Maimed is about Emunah. So it's a beautiful Maimed. It's an important Maimed. And I'm trying very hard. We're learning one Sefer, Tafshin Av, Tafshin Yud Beis, and I don't want to reteach the Maimed that I taught already. I taught like 6 or 7. In other words, my so-called favorite ones we did, so now I have to find how they're all favorites. So, the last Maimed was a Maimed about Mesiras Nefesh, and this Maimed is a Maimed about Emunah. It's one of the first Maimed that Rebbe said. The Rebbe said a Maimed on Yud Shvat Basi Legani. The Shabbos after was Hayesheves Baganim. Shabbos Vorchem Oder, he said a Maimed Ve'ela Mishpatim. This is Shabbos Vorchem Oder Sheni. In other words, it's the 4th Maimed that Rebbe ever said. And the 5th Maimed that Rebbe ever said was Purim. Because in those early years, my Maimed were longer, and they were less frequent. When I was growing up, the Rebbe said 40 or 50 Maimed a year. In those days, he said around 15 or 20 or 25 Maimed a year. But they were much longer. And in the very, very beginning, I believe this, and again, of course, this is only a matter of conjecture, that when you look at the Maimed of the Rebbe in early years, the Rebbe chose things that he felt were important for him to say at the outset, because they either reflect the generation or they affect him. In other words, the earliest Maimarim of the Rebbe are you're not allowed to say about the Rebbe favorites, but that's what they are. The Rebbe's favorite Maimarim. The Maimarim that the Rebbe liked the most. And he either liked them the most because he liked them, or he liked them the most because he felt that we needed to hear them. This is what, imagine this is the 4th Maimarim the Rebbe ever said. The first Maimarim was Basi Legani, the second Hashav Legani, they go together, they're really one Maimarim. Then was Ve'ela Mishpat. It's a Maimed about Das. One day I'll get around to doing that. But this is the 4th Maimed. But this Maimed has a distinction which is really very unusual. What's unusual about it is that all the Chabad Rabbeim wrote their own Chassidus. All the Chabad Rabbeim wrote their own Maimarim, except for the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe wrote Nigle. Alter Rebbe wrote a lot of Nigle. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch, wrote the Tshuvas. Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe actually wrote quite little. The only Chassidus that the Alter Rebbe wrote that you're able to learn relatively easy is the Tanya. It took him 20 years to put together. We have Chassidus in Ksav Yad Admor Nishmas Yedin B'Yatzmei. We have Maimarim in the Alter Rebbe's original pen, and guess what it looks like? It looks like our Rebbe's Chassidus. It's pure Kabbalah, it's code. It's impossible to understand. And you see, the Alter Rebbe's brain, how the Alter Rebbe's brain worked, but the Alter Rebbe's chush, for the Alter Rebbe to have written all Maimarim that he said, apparently, B'derech HaTeva, B'das Tachna would have been very difficult. I'm sure there's other considerations also, but that's how it seems. Because of the few places where you have Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe, the Maimarim are they're written in a very Kabbalistic style. When he said them in a very logical style, very Chabad style. But when he wrote them very, very short and very Kabbalistic. So other people wrote the Alter Rebbe's Maimarim. Other people wrote the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus. Who wrote the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus? So there were 5 people who were allowed to write his Maimarim. And 4 of them were family. He had a brother named Yehuda Leib, the Maril. He was a big chassid. My family, we're Pevners from way back. Posners, Pevners. Anybody who's a Posner and a Pevner Lubavitch is a descendant of the Alter Rebbe's brother named Mordechai, because his last name was Posner. And my great-grandmother was a Pevner. My father's mother's mother was a Pevner. But he wasn't such a big chassid of the Alter Rebbe. He was more about Nigle. Hard to call him a misnagid, but he was not a chassid. The Alter Rebbe had 3 brothers: the Yehuda Leib, the Mordechai, and the Moshe. Yehuda Leib was the chassid. He was a very big guy in Nigle. There's Tshuvas of the Maril and all these kinds of things, but also he was a big chassid. He wrote Hanochas of the Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe, and the way it's brought down is that the Teira Eir, the Tzemach Tzedek printed Teira Eir and Bereishis Hashmais. It's from the Maimarim from Tav Kuf Nun Hey Tav Kuf Nun Vav, where we assume, in other words, before he was arrested, and we assumed that the Hanochas were written by the Maril. So he was one of the people who was allowed to write down the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus. Then 2 of his sons, the Mittel Rebbe wrote the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus, and the youngest son of the Alter Rebbe, whose name was Reb Moshe, who had a very, very interesting or tragic life, depending on how you want to look at it. He lived a very, very, very long time with Reb Moshe. He's the one I told you about last week, who said that I have a Kabbalah from my father, that any mitzvah from which the body has pleasure, you do not need to be mahad. You eat on Shabbos bread and water on Shabbos. And people said to him, it's a mitzvah. So he said, ich habe mal Masere von Kabbalah von Taten, dass jede Mitzvah, welche der Guf hat no, darf man nicht machen. I have a tradition from my father that a mitzvah from which the body derives pleasure, you don't have to be extra religious about. He wrote Hanachas also. And the Rebbe has in the library an entire bichel, Samach Tes, I think, or Tov Kofayin, with Ksaved HaRabesha. He wrote my mother Mala Seder, and they printed his Hanachas. The fourth maniach of the Alter Rebbe was his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, who was 22 when the Alter Rebbe passed away. But he started writing Hanachas probably when he was 11 or 12. The guy had a mind, not like a genius, like a, I don't know what, like a house, like a street full of computers. The brain was believable, Tzemach Tzedek. His Ikorin and his Tisa, he wrote Hanachas from a very early age. Fiedeke writes, at the age of 11, Tzemach Tzedek had an adult handwriting. He didn't write like a child, he had an adult handwriting. He was an adult at the age of 11. And the fifth was a chassid by the name of Pinchas Reizes. There's actually a published book of Chassidus called Maimori Admor Hazaken, Ksav Yad HaRab. That's the name of the book. Maimori Admor Hazaken, Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, in the handwriting of the Rab. Rab means a Pinchas Reizes. The Rebbe published an entire volume. Our Rebbe published in the early years. That means about 60 years ago, an entire volume of Chassidus, Ksav Yad HaRab. The Pinchas Reizes was the only non-family member who had permission from the Alter Rebbe to transcribe, to write down his Maimorim. And there's a very, very important reason why. The important reason was because the Alter Rebbe had an obsession, mamish an obsession, a religious obsession, with what he called Lashon Harav, the original wording of the Rebbe. When he spoke, you had to write what he said verbatim, word for word. And he spoke in Yiddish. So if you tried, I told this to you before, if you tried to from Yiddish into Hebrew, you get a bunch of negatives, right? In Hebrew you say loy or ein, right? In Yiddish you say nisht farav, there isn't yes. If you ever look at my Mordech Hasidus, the grammar is not Hebrew grammar, it's Yiddish grammar. Lo yesh, elarak. Elarak means not vaden. Elarak isn't Hebrew. Elarak is the worst Hebrew in the world. Why? Because the Pinchas Reizes, the people who wrote my Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, wrote the Alter Rebbe's words verbatim, including the Yiddish redundancies. And you know the Yiddish, there's a word for it that I don't know, the use of two words to combine to make a point. And that's how the Alter Rebbe wanted people to write his Hanachas. The Pinchas Reizes was a very dedicated chassid. He had a pretty good head. He probably was a genius of geniuses. But he was so dedicated to the Alter Rebbe that he stood right next to him when he said Chassidus. And we know that the Alter Rebbe would sometimes fall on the floor and roll in Dveikis when he said Amayim Chassidus. And the Pinchas would get down on the floor with the Alter Rebbe and listen to the words he was muttering as he was rolling. You understand? He wrote word for word what the Alter Rebbe said. So the Rebbeim relied on his Hanachas. Now this was an obsession mostly of the Alter Rebbe, although our Rebbe says that with the exception of the Middle Rebbe, all the Rebbeim wanted that people should be particular about Lashon Harav. And by the way, our Rebbe made it very clear that when people wrote his Hanachas, he did not want them to be particular about Lashon Harav. He wanted them to write what he meant, not verbatim. He didn't like when people wrote his Hanachas verbatim, which is another whole parasha. But the Alter Rebbe was very, very, very particular. They should write his words mamish, because his words were very exact. So there was a very, very famous chassid, one of the most famous chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, and we have in Yeshiva Ba'as a grandson of him. His name was Baran Alevi Mistrashel, Baran Alevi Horowitz Mistrashel. His grandson here in Yeshiva is a Horowitz, but he's not a Levi, because his grandmother is a Horowitz, a Levi. In other words, a Horowitz married a Horowitz. A non-Levi Horowitz married a Levi Horowitz. So he's not a Levi, even though he comes from Baran Strashel. Baran Strashel was a great chassid. The Beis Rebbe calls him a Talmud. The Tzafid Rebbe calls him Rav Gon, Rav Tzadik, and Rav Kodesh. The Gon, the Tzadik, and the Kodesh. He was a very, very great chassid, a big servant of Hashem and a big follower of the Alter Rebbe. Reb Aaron Halevi Horowitz from Strashele, and he also wrote Hanachas on the Alter Rebbe. In fact, there's Chassidus that's printed that used to be outlawed by Chabad, but then it's been inlawed by Chabad because the Rebbe used to learn them himself. The Rebbe even quotes them. Reb Aaron Halevi Horowitz Mistrashele also wrote Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, but he was not careful about this rule of writing word for word. He wrote whatever he wanted, how he understood it. And the Alter Rebbe called him in. He didn't write word for word from the Alter Rebbe. He wrote whatever he understood. The Alter Rebbe called him in and says, you cannot write Hanachas unless you write verbatim, word for word. He had the kind of memory to do it, but he didn't want to do it because it didn't make sense to him. He wanted to make it in a way that was coherent. And the Alter Rebbe warned him that he has to stop writing Hanachas in freehand. He can't just write the thoughts, he has to write word for word what the Alter Rebbe said. And it became an impasse. He wouldn't back off, and the Alter Rebbe was insistent. So the Alter Rebbe punished him twice, that he cannot come to Liadi for 2 years. To punish such a man that he can't come to the Rebbe for 2 years is like depriving you of oxygen. Mamish. Huh?
They couldn't say Arois from Lubavitch yet.
They said Arois from Liadi. So for 2 years he couldn't come, then he came again, and the same thing happened the second time. And again the Alter Rebbe said to him, you have to be careful to write Lashon Harav, and he wasn't. And the Alter Rebbe told him, you can't zweiten Mal twice, that he cannot come to Lubavitch for 2 whole years. The end was, it's probably a little bit more complicated than this. There was probably some politics also. He left Liadi and didn't come back. He didn't come to Alter Rebbe anymore. The end of the Alter Rebbe's life, Rabbi Strashela did not come anymore. When he stopped coming, the Alter Rebbe was very upset. Even though the Alter Rebbe was the one who punished him, the Alter Rebbe said, "Men hat mir a rois gerissen an oig vom Kopf." An eye was gouged out of my head. He felt very bad when Rabbi Levi stopped coming. Again, I'm assuming that there was some. The Chassidim helped the Alter Rebbe do his job. You know, we have to.
The wording that he said, is that verbatim, or is that was more of a...
This is, it's Teresh Baal Peh, and it's over 200 years old. So, actually it's in the Rishimis. The Rebbe told us the Frierdiker Rebbe, I think. Frierdiker told to the Rebbe in the Rishimis. So he stopped coming, Rabbi Levi Strashel. He became his own Rebbe, he was a Middle Rebbe's competitor. He published quite a few Sfarim of Chassidus, not so many, but a number. He had a sefer called Shada Yichud, good Sfarim. But the Lubavitcher didn't learn it because he was the outlaw. Until somebody in Poland saw the Rebbe sitting in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Beis HaMedrash learning the sefer from Rabbi Strashel. So he walked up to the Rebbe and he said, I'm a little bit, our Rebbe, who was the son of the Frierdiker Rebbe, I'm surprised that you're learning this sefer. He's the other team. You know, he's the shul we don't daven and he's the bad guy. And the Rebbe's response was, this is Zeir Atifim Sefer. The Rebbe afterwards, it's a very deep sefer. Like, don't give me politics, this is a wonderful book. And although the Alter Rebbe was not happy that he didn't write Hanachas Rebbeinu, the Rebbe found space in his neshama, in his conscience. I got to learn this too. And I believe the Rebbe is mitzayin to the Rebbe. The Rebbe said years and years ago, but the Sudas upstairs, that if he had the right kind of Chassidim, he would reprint this Strashel Chassidus. It's a famous joke in Lubavitch that there was somebody who didn't understand what was going on. So the Rebbe spoke by the Tish upstairs, by the Frierdiker Rebbe's Dira, about this, that if he had Chassidim Bari Samach, he'd print the Chassidus as the Strashel. So when they came down after the Suda, someone said to some guy, knew what did the Rebbe talk about? He said, oh, today the Rebbe discussed Mr. Shelach's Chassidus. Mr. Shelach, for those who do not know, was Noach's great-grandfather. Noach, the one who made the Teva. He confused Strashel with Mr. Shelach, Amachaya. But that was the story. But the Rebbe Alter was Merachik. What was the big taina about Strashel? Why did he feel like he doesn't have to listen? Because the Mittler Rebbe didn't listen. The Mittler Rebbe wrote his father's Maimorim in longhand. So the Alter Rebbe could say Mem for 5 minutes, Mittler could write 20 pages. Meaning the Mittler Rebbe didn't do what his father instructed, which is write Lashon Harav, word for word, the Alter Rebbe's own words. And Anna Strashel and Mittler Rebbe were brothers. They were so close, they were closer than brothers. When they were young, later there was a big machlokes between them, but when they were young, somebody saw the two of them. They were young men. The Mittler Rebbe must have been 14, and Rabbi Strashel was probably 20. He was older than the Mittler Rebbe. But they had these super minds, and they were big oivdim, they were very dedicated to the Derech of Chabad. They were best friends. And somebody saw the two of them holding hands, physically holding hands. So he commented to the Alter Rebbe, two friends that never separate. This is a Lashon in Zohar, which is about Chochma and Bina. Chochma and Bina are Zivugaya, they're always together. So someone commented to the Alter Rebbe about the Strashel and the Mittler Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe gave a snort, a sound which denoted displeasure. And he said, Alavad la mispash. I wish that was true. And then many years later, there was this machlekes between them. The Mittler Rebbe had permission for the Alter Rebbe to do what he wanted. So Rabbi Strashel said, why your son and not me? When the Mittler Rebbe wrote about the Alter Rebbe, he wrote, the Alter Rebbe could say a page, and the Mittler could write 20 pages. The Mittler Rebbe's style was so elaborate, was so detailed, he would just explain and explain. If you read the Maimon of the Mittler Rebbe, he sounds like a mashpia giving a shiur. He just talks. Just explains and explains and explains and develops. Mamish, like a mashpia talking to you. Not the printed Sfarim. The printed Sfarim he edited. The Maimorim. It sounds like mamish, a person talking to you and explaining. Now the Vart was, the teretz was, that the Mittler Rebbe was a higher madrega than the Rabbi Strashel. The Mittler Rebbe was a Rebbe, the Rabbi Strashel wasn't. But the Rabbi Strashel could not understand that. And there's another thing. The Frierdiker Rebbe says in a Sikha about this, that the Mittler Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek had a big argument. The Mittler Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek were uncle and nephew, and later they were father-in-law and son-in-law. But they were both makabel from the Alter Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek is really not the third generation of Chabad. Lubavitch doesn't have a third generation. We have a first generation and 2 second generations and a fourth generation. Because the Tzemach Tzedek was makabel from the Alter Rebbe directly. And 95% of the Maimon of the Tzemach Tzedek are not based on the Middle Rebbes. You have sometimes based on the Middle Rebbes, but 95% of the Tzemach Tzedek are on the Alter Rebbes. But the Tzemach Tzedek felt that when you write a Maimed on the Alter Rebbe's Maimed, everybody who reads it has to know clearly what's the original and what's the notes. So he used to put parentheses, and he would write very short. Tzemach Tzedek would write cliff notes, very, very short. So it was clear, this is the Maimed and this is the Biur, this is the commentary. The Mittler Rebbe didn't put parentheses, and he'd speak for pages. So it's impossible to see which of the words of the Alter Rebbe's original, and which of the Mittler Rebbe's addition. So the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, this is a big argument that they had, Shver and Edom, father-in-law and son-in-law, second Rebbe and third Rebbe, about how to approach my bottom of the Alter Rebbe. But the Frierdiker Rebbe writes that the truth of the matter is, men can seilen Asius Haravi pedal. If you look carefully at the Maimonim of the Mittler Rebbe, you can count the original words of the Alter Rebbe like pearls. They're all there. In other words, the Mittler Rebbe was careful about Lashon Hara, he just wrote very long Megillas. Here's the bottom line. The Alter Rebbe had a blind love for his oldest son, the Mittler Rebbe. But it wasn't blind at all. Alter Rebbe knew who his son was. And Alter Rebbe used to, the implication was that Alter Rebbe held that the Mittler Rebbe is greater than him. Alter Rebbe held that the Mittler Rebbe is a higher Madrega than he was. He adored his son. You don't have any relationship between a father and a son in Lubavitch and our generations of Rebbes like that. The relation of Alter Rebbe and Mittler Rebbe is extraordinary. Alter Rebbe spoke about the Mittler Rebbe with such reverence, mamish, with such reverence. So he trusted him. So the Mittler Rebbe, he used to write Maimorim with the Alter Rebbe with his own commentary, and he would even say Chassidus. During the Alter Rebbe's lifetime, the Mittler Rebbe would say Chassidus, and when he said Chassidus, he didn't just say his father's words, he said his father's words with his interpretation, because he had that mandate. But here's the bottom line. The Alter Rebbe did not write his own Maimorim. And 5 men were commissioned to write the Maimorim. His brother, the Maril, his 2 sons, the Mittler Rebbe and the Moshe, his grandson, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and this one chaz, the Pinchas Reizes. In order to be permitted to write Hanochas of the Alter Rebbe, you had to be Medayik and Lashon, read word for word. Today, we have a whole shelf, or 2 whole shelves, of Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, and oftentimes they'll print 2 different Hanochas, 2 different drafts of the same Maimon. And the reason they're different is because one is from one Maniach, and one from the other Maniach. Very frequently, you'll have Hanocha from, let's say, the Tzemach Tzedek, or from somebody else, and then the Mittler Rebbe's. So it's the same Maimon. But one Hanocha is 4 pages long, another Hanocha is 15 pages long. Because one wrote the Alter Rebbe said, another one wrote the Alter Rebbe meant. You understand? That's how it was. But, beginning with the Mittler Rebbe, there's a very, very long way to make a short point. Beginning with the Mittler Rebbe, the Rabbeim wrote their own Chassidus. Mittler wrote his own Chassidus. Tzemach Tzedek wrote his own Chassidus. The Rebbe Rash wrote his own Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab wrote his Chassidus. Sichas not. But there became a tradition that the Rabbeim wrote Maimorim themselves. Now, if you know how Maimorim are developed, certainly by the time you get to the Rebbe Marash, what the Rabbeim would do is they would take an existing ksad. They didn't write the whole Maimer. They took an old Maimer, and they'd make marks. Over here, put in words. Over here, put in words. Someone would copy. They'd go over to a chassid and say, there were people whose job it was to be the cipher, the scribe of the Rebbe. Say, copy this Maimer from here to here. Copy this Maimer from here to here. Copy this Maimer from here. He'd come in with all the copies, and then the Rebbe would put them together. He'd paste them together. He'd cut and paste, take out words, add words, change form, and then he would write a whole Maimer. So the Maimorim were actually built on the earlier texts of the earlier Rabbeim. By the Frierdiker Rebbe, as far as I know, every single Maimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe is a Maimer from the Rebbe Rashab with notes. And some of them, there's no notes, just word for word as fathers. And you could see which of the Rebbe Rashab's words and which of the Frierdiker's. All the Rabbeim wrote their own Chassidus. So the Chabad tradition for 5 generations, the Mittler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rayatz, was that the Rabbeim wrote their own Maimorim. Then comes the illustrious 7th generation. It's the greatest of all. It's going to bring Mashiach. The Rebbe once said that the 6 generations are the 6 days of the week. So the 7th generation is like Shabbos. And some chassid said, "What? Like Shabbos?" Like Saturday night in a bar, like Shabbos. But the Rebbe said, the 7 Doiros, our generation is Shabbos, finished, the highest, the holiest, the greatest. And the Rebbe, there was no Rebbe like our Rebbe. I mean, obviously, the simple fact was there was no Rebbe who was busier than our Rebbe. But there's other considerations as well. And the Rebbe could not write his Maimorim. He couldn't do it. But he tried. Twice. And the first effort is right here. When you open up the book that you have in front, you go to page Chav Hey. Chav Hey and Chavav, the Rebbe wrote himself. And Chav Zayin is what the Rebbe said. Twice the Rebbe tried to write a Maimer. But the Rebbe knew that if you write a Maimer, you have to write it in longhand. And the Rebbe, I mean, you're not allowed to say about a Rebbe that he can't, but the Rebbe couldn't do it. The Rebbe didn't have the time, and there never was a Rebbe like ours. There never was a Rebbe nearly as busy as our Rebbe. It was not normal, the way the Rebbe worked. And in the earlier years, he worked harder. The Rebbe was very physically strong, but the Rebbe gave himself to people with such a reckless regard that the Rebbe pushed himself. The Rebbe was responsible for the whole world, was right after the Holocaust. And he had so much responsibility. The Rebbe, Pasha, didn't have the time. And apparently, it was hard for him in nature to write he could speak for an hour, but he can't write 10 pages. He could write 10 lines and you figure out what he was thinking. That was his style. They say that the Frierdiker Rebbe used to speak very short and write very long. The Rebbe used to speak very long and write very short. It's a personality. They say the same thing about the Rabbi. When the Rabbi spoke, it was very easy to listen to. When he wrote, it's impossible to understand what he's saying. It's on some level, even by tzaddikim, it's an even personality. So if you look at the first page Chav Hey, and I made myself a copy of the Maimed. If you go to page Lamed Hey, this page is the second time the Purim Maimed that Rebbe tried to write himself. He wrote one page, and he quickly ran out of ink. And they found these Hanochas after Gimel Tammuz. When we were growing up, we didn't have these. They found in the library twice that Rebbe started to actually write the Maimed, and the Rebbe didn't finish. So the Rebbe trusted Rabbi Yael, and it was very, very, very strange. It was particularly strange since the Rebbe not only didn't write those on my Bible, but didn't even edit them. Yael Khan was 20 years old. When the Rebbe said the Maimed Basilic, Yael Khan was 20 years old. When the Rebbe said this Maimed, Yael Khan had just turned 21 years old. The whole Lubavitch knows his birthday because in his letters he writes about his Yechidus. His birthday was Yud Zayin Shvat. So it was the week after Yud Shvat. Yael Khan was a young bacher, a genius with a photographic memory. You made a speech, he gave it to you back word for word. You know Yael Khan's story, you know how he got to 770. The Rashag visited Israel in 1949, and he came to the yeshiva in Rishon LeZion. And he said a Maimed. That's what the Rabbi's children did. They said Chassidus. He chazed a Maimed, and some little shmekel goes over to him and says, maybe you say another one. Maybe you say another one. So he looks at him and says, what? I say another one? Study this one. He's this one I got. He says, you got it? You know the Maimed that I said you could be back? He said, yes. He gave it back to him word for word. So he said a second Maimed. And then he said, maybe say a third one. So Rashag said to him, this one you have also? He says, yeah. Can you give it back to me? Anyway, this guy turned out to have this incredible memory, and he didn't have a memory, he understood very deeply. So that Rashag wrote to Frierdiker Rebbe that I found a superman, a super boy. He was 19 years old at the time. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, send him to New York. So Rashag paid for Yael Khan and Noskia Gerari to come here. He had to make the arrangements and to sponsor him, whatever it took to bring him to the Rebbe as a student. He arrived a week after Yud Shvat or something like that. Right after Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. He came to see the Frierdiker Rebbe, but he never saw him. So I don't know if you guys know the story that when Yael was 4 years old, the family left Russia. You know the story? It's a good piece. I once repeated to Yael Khan. He got really, really nervous, but it is a true story because his father writes the story in his book. They passed through Vienna on the way to Israel from Russia. So they were in the train station, and he heard Fola Khan, Yael Khan's father, heard that the Frierdiker Rebbe was in a resort area in Perkesdorf outside Wien. So he left his family in the hotel in the train station. He went to the Frierdiker Rebbe for Yechidus. And he went to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe talked to him on his way to Israel. Then he goes back to where his family is, and he sees ahead of him the Ramash, our Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe had sent the Rebbe to those children to give them chocolate. There were 4 girls and a boy. Yael was the youngest. Now, I would bet heavy money that was the single time that the Frierdiker Rebbe sent our Rebbe to give children chocolate. Yael Khan was 4 years old, and the Frierdiker Rebbe sent the Rebbe to give him chocolate. Now, officially gave chocolate to all the kids, but the chocolate was for Yael Khan. There's no doubt in my mind that Yael Khan's purpose on this earth was established He was 4 years old. The Friedrich Rebbe sent the Rebbe to give him chocolate. Think about it. The 4-year-old. And there's a story that Rabbi Elkan started to ask questions. That he doesn't understand. That when he was in Russia, he had a Malamed. And his sisters have a Malamed. So there's one Rebbe, there's a second Rebbe. And now my father has a Rebbe. In Russia, every school teacher was called a Rebbe. So he was a little boy and he was asking, how could there be Rebbes? And then he concluded there's different levels in Rebbe. He was 4 years old. And the Rebbe, our Rebbe, told his father, a Kleipzer, good Fernande, he knows how to discern, knows how to separate. This Yael Khan's purpose on this earth was to be the Rebbe's tape recorder. I mean, if not for Yael Khan, the amount of Torah that Rebbe said that we would have would be reduced probably by a fraction of 10. We wouldn't have half, we'd have 1/10. Yael Khan's memory and his skill is the primary reason that Rebbe has as much. Rebbe spoke. The Rebbe didn't write any of it. They had no time. They didn't have time. And Rabbi Yael recorded it and wrote it. It's not simple. Yael Khan is nicht kaposhte Zach. It's not. I'm not saying he was a Rebbe. He wasn't. He was a buzz of a dam with all the chesed of a buzz of a dam. But his mind, his brain came into this world to be Deil Umash, came into his Rabbi Acher. This neshama came into this world that the Rebbe should be able to have his Torah preserved, even though the Rebbe didn't have time to preserve it himself. That's just the way I see it, and I don't think it's such a radical thing to say. So Yael was a bachadol. He came here. So the first thing he wanted to do was go back to Israel. He came to see the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. So he went over to the Rebbe, to the Ramash. He said to the Ramash, I came here to see the Rebbe, the Shver, the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, maybe I should go back to Israel. And the Rebbe told him, the Rebbe, the Shver, knew what was going to happen. The Frierdiker Rebbe knew what was going to happen. And he told you to come anyway. He said, Simon, you're supposed to stay here. So he stayed. And the weird part of the story was that Ashag sponsored him. The Ashag brought him here. So the Ashag thought he was one of his boys. And during that year, he had to play the game. Not to be disrespectful to the Ashag, but on the other hand, the Rebbe was the Rebbe's guy. And he started writing down the Rebbe's Torah. And then the first year, the Rebbe actually edited a lot of the Torah. And then comes Basi Lagani, and the Rebbe says a Maimer. So he was by the Rebbe Yechidus that week. And the Rebbe says to him, did you prepare the Sichas from the Fabrengen of Yud Shvat? The Fabrengen of Yud Shvat, the Rebbe edited the entire Fabrengen. The Rebbe did not edit the Sichas Memorim. But the first Fabrengen, the Rebbe edited the entire Fabrengen, and the Maimon printed, look at the Sichas Cheli Beis and Eisofas, and in other places. The first Fabrengen, the Fabrengen that the Rebbe said when he officially became a Rebbe, which is really what's the word? An inaugural Fabrengen. It's not Stam Sichas. The Rebbe spoke with that Fabrengen about the whole future of Lubavitch as he sees it. The Rebbe edited. So the Rebbe says to Rabbi Yael, did you prepare the Hanachas? He says, I'm working on it. And the Rebbe says, what about the Maimer? So Rabbi Yael never thought for a moment that he's going to have to write the Maimer. Because the Rebbe wrote the Maimer. Since the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Maimer. So Rabbi Yael says to the Rebbe, the Maimer with Mistam Mezicha is game B'Ksav. I'm imagining the Maimer the Rebbe is going to write himself. And the Rebbe says to Rabbi Yael, was the Gedektish? I think good. You remember so well. You trunkel zufu mashke. You drank too much mashke. So Rabbi Yael says to the Rebbe, Episazoi, something like that. I drank a little bit too much. So the Rebbe said, Rabbi Yael, do trag and what you can. You bring in the Hanach as you have it, and I'll see. And Rabbi Yael did a spanking job, a brilliant job. The Hanach is almost word for word. Later they found the tape. But when he wrote the Hanach, he wrote it from memory. It's almost word for word. And that first Maimon the Rebbe edited. And apparently the Rebbe felt that he could trust this boy. He was 20 years old, 21 years old. Rabbi Yael Khan became the Rebbe's chayzer, and he served the Rebbe for 40 years. His whole life. Rabbi Yael Khan's entire life is serving the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's so interesting. There are other people like that, but he, in the area of the Rebbe's Torah, he serves the Rebbe. It's Pashat, incredible. He stood there, short little guy, about 5'6", 5'7", looked like he's dreaming, and he went in and he got it. Before the Rebbe was finished speaking, he had reconstructed the whole Sikha, and he knew exactly what the Rebbe means and how the Rebbe is going to say it. I once was sitting with a former teacher of mine, Rabbi Pekarsky from Military, who said to me, he helped Rabbi Yael Khan and Nochas. He said, we would argue about what word the Rebbe used. He said, well, who do you think understood what it meant? We don't understand what's right. The Rebbe created Rashi Sikhas. It took years for people to learn to think like that. Who understood? Who got it right away? Yael. His brain was so strong. It wasn't just his memory, his ability to understand. But anyway, so this is a long way to make a point. Here is a case where the Rebbe actually started to write his own Maimer. It's one of the two cases, and he never finished. So I managed to give you a little bit of history of Hasidus and bring you up to speed with the Rebbe. This is a special Maimer. It's the fourth Maimer the Rebbe ever said. Clearly it's important to the Rebbe. And it's one of the two Maimorim that the Rebbe Koyachal actually tried to write himself. And there's one more thing. There's another thing. This Maimer is very similar to the Maimer of Yata Tetzaveh. You know about Yata Tetzaveh, right? The Maimer that the Rebbe gave out 2 weeks before his stroke. It's all about Emunah. This Maimer is also about Emunah. I just convinced myself that there's a connection here. That's all it is. But the Rebbe, this is the fourth Maimer the Rebbe said, and the Maimer is about Emunah. So we're going to learn this Maimer now, Bli Neder, Emetz Hashem, but we're not starting from the beginning. We'll do the Maimer inside out. We're going to start on page Gimel, which is on page Chof Ches, and we're going to learn the Maimer inside out. We're going to learn the heart of the Maimer first, and then we're going to learn the beginning of the Maimer and the end of the Maimer second, which I in my other classes I do it all the time. I just have never done it here. I'm doing it now with you. I'm going to finish the class with this piece of information. Okay? In the olden days, once upon a time, this goes back before our time, in times of the Alter Rebbe, the Middle Rebbe, those generations, a Maimer started with a Pasuk or a Gemara and sometimes with a Lahavin, like the Havin in Chanukah, something like that, to understand the idea of Chanukah. And the Rebbe would ask a bunch of questions, and then he would change the subject, talk about something Kabbalistic and mystical and esoteric and lofty, and at the end, based on the whole biur, he would answer the questions. So the Hasidim in the olden days used to call it the Maimer and the biur. The Maimer was the pasuk and the questions and the answers, the beginning and the end, the flanks. The digression, the subject that the Rebbe raised intermittently as an aside, in the middle was called a biur. So Maimarim start with the subject, they finish with the same, Maimarim like a pyramid. It starts with something, it finishes with the same subject, and in the middle it digresses. And sometimes you'll have two of that, right? Sometimes you can start, it's the Maimer starts with one subject, changes to a second subject, moves on to a third subject, which takes up a lot of space, then goes back to the second subject and answers the question at the beginning, and then answers the first. It goes in an inverse order, backwards. So what I often do is, when I teach a Maimer, I'll separate out the different sections and learn them one at. The truth is we did this in the previous Maimer also. We did the whole Vayeshev, did the whole Chanukah, and then we did the whole Shalom. We're going to learn this Maimer from the inside out. We're going to start from Emunah, and we're going to learn Emunah. Emunah goes from the bottom of page Chof Ches all the way till the halfway page Lamed Gimel. In other words, it's about 5 Amudim. 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 Amudim. And then, after we finish with that, and I'm hoping to delve into that because I want to talk about Emunah, we'll do the beginning and the end, which is Abachtas HaShekel. The Maimer also has another feature which is very important to our Rebbe, very, very important to our Rebbe, is it explains the necessity of Moshe Rabbeinu. Why do you need Moshe Rabbeinu? Why do you need Moshe Rabbeinu? Emunah we have from Avraham Avinu. Like it says in the Pasuk, Churi Mirei Shamona, a gift from the first believer. Emunah we have from Avraham Avinu. So if every Jew has Emunah from Avraham Avinu, why do you have to have Moshe Rabbeinu? Does anybody know the answer to that question? So that the Emunah should have teeth. If you believe in God and you pray to God to help you violate one of God's commandments, you have Avraham Avinu's Emunah. If you believe in God, then because you believe in God, if God says not to do something, you don't do it, you have the help of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't give us faith, but he personalizes faith. He internalizes faith. Ure'eh Emunah, he shepherds faith. That's what this Maimer is about. And we will learn this tomorrow. Thank you for coming and listening.